Mikela Panday's Selective Outrage. Silent on PNM's 4%, hysterical about UNC's 10%. An editorial by Professor Wall Street. Mikela Panday's latest Sunday Guardian editorial, The Back Pay Bluff, represents yet another installment in her relentless campaign against Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar. The Patriotic Front leader's breathless alarm about the government's 10% increase to public servants, delivered exactly as promised, would be almost credible if Panday hadn't remained completely, conspicuously silent when the PNM offered public servants a paltry 4% after years of wage freeze. The pattern is unmistakable and insulting to readers' intelligence. 10 years of PNM wage suppression warranted no Panday editorials. 8 months of UNC governance delivering a 10% increase, more than double what the PNM offered, suddenly requires lengthy Sunday Guardian commentary characterizing the fulfillment of campaign promises as a bluff and backpedaling. This isn't principled criticism about compensation structures or fiscal responsibility. This is transparent partisan vendetta dressed up as worker advocacy. And the hypocrisy is so glaring, so undeniable, that it demands comprehensive exposure. Here are 10 reasons why the Back Pay Bluff editorial exposes Panday's transparent vendetta against Persad-Bissessar. 1. Complete silence on PNM's insulting 4% offer. The most damning indictment of Panday's editorial is what she didn't write during the PNM's decade in power. After years of wage freeze, the PNM finally offered public servants 4%, an amount that didn't even keep pace with inflation, that represented real wage decline, that insulted workers who had waited years for relief. Where was Mikela Panday's editorial then? Where was her concern for the 25,000 public servants getting less than half what the UNC is now providing? Where was her alarm about broken promises or inadequate compensation? The silence was complete and deliberate. Panday had no problem with the PNM's 4% offer, no editorials characterizing it as insufficient, no demands for transparency, no concern about workers' frustration. Yet when the UNC delivers 10%, more than double the PNM's offer, Panday suddenly discovers grave concerns about public sector compensation. This selective outrage destroys any credibility Panday might claim as worker advocate. She accepts 4% from the PNM, but attacks 10% from the UNC. This isn't about workers' interests. It's about political vendetta. 2. Dishonest framing. Promise kept, not broken. Panday's entire editorial rests on a fundamentally dishonest premise that the government is backpedaling from its promise or attempting a bluff. But the facts directly contradict this characterization. The UNC promised 10%. The UNC is delivering 10%. The PSA and CPO signed off on Tuesday morning. Workers will receive their increase. The promise is being kept. Panday attempts to transform this promise fulfillment into broken promise by focusing on payment structure, claiming that because some portion may be in bonds rather than all cash, the government is somehow reneging. But this is deliberate distortion. The promise was 10% increase. Whether that increase arrives 100% in cash or in a combination of cash and interest-bearing bonds doesn't change that the promise is being honored. In fact, as we'll discuss, bonds may actually benefit workers more than pure cash through interest earnings. 3. Ignoring the mathematical advantage of bonds. Perhaps most dishonest is Panday's complete failure to acknowledge that bonds can actually provide greater value to workers than equivalent cash payments. This omission appears deliberate. Acknowledging this fact would undermine her entire workers being cheated narrative. Government bonds provide principal amount, the face value of the bond. Interest earnings over the bond's term. Investment vehicle for those who don't have access to similar instruments. Forced savings that many workers need but struggle to maintain. A worker receiving $10,000 in bonds, earning even modest interest over several years, will end up with significantly more than $10,000 in pure value. Depending on terms and interest rates, the total return could be $11,000, $12,000 or more, meaning workers actually receive more than the promised 10% when interest is included. Panday knows this. Anyone with basic financial literacy knows this. Yet her editorial completely ignores this mathematical reality because acknowledging it would expose that the government isn't cheating workers. It's potentially providing them greater value than pure cash. 4. The economy on brink of collapse strawman. Panday devotes significant editorial space to attacking the government's characterization of inheriting an economy on the brink of collapse, asking why they would promise 10% if the economy was so dire. But this represents deliberate misunderstanding of both fiscal reality and political commitment. The UNC inherited an economy severely damaged by PNM mismanagement, declining energy production, lost OFAC license, collapsed Dragon Deal, increased poverty rates. These are documented facts. Despite this challenging inheritance, the UNC committed to delivering 10% to public servants because it was the right thing to do and because they believed they could manage the economy well enough to honor that commitment. And they have, delivering more than double what the PNM offered despite inheriting worse fiscal conditions. Panday's attack actually proved the UNC's superior economic management. They inherited economic damage from the PNM, yet still deliver more to workers than the PNM did. 5. Ignoring that cash advance is coming before Christmas. Panday mentions in passing that $500 million advance would be paid in cash before December 23rd, but frames this negatively as if providing $500 million in cash to workers before Christmas represents some kind of failure or inadequacy. Most public servants would be thrilled to receive substantial cash before the holidays. This represents immediate relief, holiday spending capacity, and demonstration that government is working urgently to deliver on promises. Yet Panday presents this as somehow problematic rather than positive. This reveals editorial determination to find fault regardless of actual circumstances. Delivering $500 million in cash before Christmas should be presented as good news for workers. Instead, Panday frames it as evidence of broken promises. This isn't journalism. It's predetermined narrative searching for supporting details. 6. The transparent vendetta pattern. Panday's editorial continues a now familiar pattern. Regardless of what Prime Minister Prasad Bisesa does, Panday finds fault. Economic revival, insufficient. Energy sector growth, problematic. Dragon Deal resurrection, concerning. U.S. security cooperation, dangerous. And now delivering 10% to public servants, a bluff. When criticism is universal and indiscriminate, it loses credibility. No leader governs so poorly that every decision deserves condemnation. Panday's relentless negativity reveals someone whose opposition isn't based on policy substance, but on personal animosity toward the Prime Minister. This vendetta-driven approach serves Panday's political ambitions and personal grudges, not workers' interests or informed public discourse. If Panday genuinely cared about public servants, she would have criticized the PNM's 4% as vigorously as she attacks the UNC's 10%. that she didn't exposes her true motivations.
7. Mischaracterizing normal negotiation as deception.
Panday presents ongoing negotiations about payment structure as evidence of government deception or confusion. But this fundamentally misunderstands how large-scale compensation agreements work. The headline agreement, 10% increase, was signed Tuesday morning. That's the major accomplishment and promise fulfillment. Working out implementation details about payment timing, cash versus bonds ratios, and specific distribution mechanisms is normal, necessary follow-up negotiation. Every major compensation agreement involves headline terms followed by implementation details. Framing this standard process as backpedaling or workers being left in the middle of a tug of war represents either stunning ignorance of how negotiations work or deliberate mischaracterization for political advantage.
Given Panday's political experience, the latter seems far more likely. She knows this is normal process but presents it as scandal because her goal is undermining the government, not informing readers. 8. The no comment distortion. Panday characterizes Minister Tanku's responses as evasive or inadequate, claiming he won't explain details and that there's silence about what workers will receive. But this again mischaracterizes appropriate communication during active negotiations. Ministers cannot and should not publicly detail every aspect of ongoing negotiation before they're complete. Doing so would undermine the negotiation process and potentially create confusion if details change. The responsible approach is announcing major agreements, 10% increase, done. Then working out implementation details before comprehensive public explanation.
Yet Panday presents this responsible communication approach as sinister evasion. She demands ministers publicly detail incomplete negotiations, then would undoubtedly criticize them for creating confusion if those details change during final negotiations. This creates the impossible standard we've seen before. The government is wrong regardless of approach. Announce too much too early, irresponsible. Exercise appropriate discretion during active negotiations, evasive and secretive. When you're criticized either way, the criticism isn't principled, it's predetermined.
9. Ignoring workers' actual voice.
While Panday claims to speak for workers' interests, she conveniently ignores that workers and their representatives signed off on the agreement. The PSA and CPO reached agreement Tuesday morning. This represents workers' chosen representatives determining the package meets their members' needs. Panday positions herself as more concerned about workers than their own elected representatives, the ultimate paternalistic presumption. She knows better than the PSA what workers need. She understands their interests better than their own unions. This represents extraordinary arrogance. Workers have representatives to negotiate on their behalf. Those representatives agreed to the package. Panday's insistence that she knows better than workers' own unions exposes that her editorial isn't about worker advocacy. It's about finding any available angle to attack the government. 10. The fundamental comparative failure. Most fundamentally, Panday's editorial completely fails the basic journalistic test of comparative analysis. To fairly assess the UNC's 10% offer, responsible commentary would compare it to what the PNM offered 4%, what workers received during PNM decade, years of wage freeze, what workers are receiving now, 10%, more than double. How this compares to inflation and cost of living, whether this represents improvement over previous administration. Panday does none of this comparative analysis because doing so would expose that workers are substantially better off under the UNC than they were under the PNM. The comparison would reveal that her criticism is transparently partisan rather than substantively grounded. An honest editorial would acknowledge, while there are questions about implementation details, it's undeniable that 10% represents significant improvement over the PNM's 4% offer. Workers are receiving more than double what the previous administration provided, despite the UNC inheriting worse fiscal conditions. But Panday can't write that honest assessment because it would contradict her predetermined narrative that the UNC is failing workers. The consequences of vendetta journalism. When political figures like Panday use media platforms for transparent vendettas rather than honest analysis, several consequences follow. Public trust erodes. Readers recognize partisan agendas and dismiss commentary as unreliable political positioning rather than fair assessment. Workers get confused. When commentators attack governments that are actually delivering improvements, workers may not recognize their interests are being served. Standards disappear. When 10% is attacked more vigorously than 4% based solely on which party is delivering it, policy evaluation becomes meaningless. Credibility collapses. Figures who claim worker advocacy while ignoring that workers are receiving more than double previous offers lose any claim to represent workers' interests. In conclusion, the vendetta exposed.
Mikela Panday's Back Pay Bluff editorial represents transparent political vendetta disguised as worker advocacy. Her complete silence when the PNM offered 4%, followed by lengthy criticism when the UNC delivers 10%, exposes partisan motivation rather than genuine concern for public servants.
The facts are simple and undeniable. The UNC promised 10%. The UNC is delivering 10%. Workers are receiving more than double what the PNM offered. Some portion may be in bonds that actually provide greater value through interest than equivalent cash. Implementation details are being negotiated, normal process for agreements this size. Yet Panday characterizes promise fulfillment as bluff, substantial increase as inadequate, and normal negotiation process as deception. This isn't honest analysis, it's predetermined opposition, searching for supporting narrative. Most damningly, Panday never wrote editorial criticizing the PNM's 4% offer. That silence, combined with current hysteria about 10%, exposes everything about her motivations. She accepts inadequate compensation from preferred parties, but attacks superior compensation from opposed parties. This isn't worker advocacy, it's partisan vendetta. Workers receiving 10% with potential bond interest earnings should recognize Panday isn't fighting for their interests. She's using their compensation as weapon against a prime minister she opposes for personal political reasons having nothing to do with workers' welfare. Public servants deserve better than being used as props in Mikela Panday's transparent vendetta against Prime Minister Persad Bissessar. They deserve honest assessment recognizing they're receiving more than double what the PNM offered, despite the UNC inheriting worse economic conditions. Until Panday explains why 4% from the PNM warranted silence, while 10% from the UNC warrants lengthy criticism. Her editorials about public sector compensation deserve recognition for what they are. Partisan attacks masquerading as worker advocacy. Vendetta journalism pretending to be principled commentary. The UNC promised 10%. The UNC is delivering 10%. Workers will benefit from both cash and interest-earning bonds. That's promise kept, not back pay bluff. Regardless of how desperately Mikela Panday needs it to be otherwise
for her vendetta narrative.